There we go. And I am very happy to introduce this evening's program host. His name is Charles Lagerbaum. Lagerbaum received his MA in History and Archaeology at the University of Maine with research and excavation of a Revolutionary War truck house of the Penobscot River, on the Penobscot River. An avid scuba diver, he has organized underwater surveys of ships' remains in Maine lakes, as well as the 1779 Penobscot expedition and the 17th century English galleon Angel Gabriel off Pemaquid. He worked in Antarctica with glacial geology research teams from Quaternary Institute, now the Climate Change Institute. A published author, Lagerbaum has written, lectured, and given presentations on cruise ships, sailing vessels, and ashore. He covers topics related to history, life, politics, and science of Antarctica, Cape Horn, Maine whaling, and colonial Maine and New England maritime history. So we may have to have him back for a few more talks based on his background. Lagerbaum teaches AP US History at Belfast Area High School and makes his home in the coast of Maine. So again, I'm so thrilled to offer all of you this wonderful presentation tonight by Charles Lagerbaum. And now I'm going to turn it all over to you.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you everyone for being here. I'm really excited talking about this topic. I really enjoyed digging into it. It became kind of a quest of local history. And it seemed like every time I chatted with somebody about it, I was telling them about the history, or I was looking into the history of a whale ship or something. They always went, "Oh, you should talk to my neighbor. I think his great-grandfather went." And it seemed like every time I shook the tree, more information fell out. And when I started this research, I was just interested in connecting Maine with the polar regions in general. But the whaling just kept coming out, more and more information of Maine connections. And I thought, you know, and this is where I developed my thesis, that I think Maine could pretty much hold its own against the more well-known whaling centers of like New Bedford and Nantucket, because it's just a wealth of information and connections. And so my task tonight is to kind of take you through what I discovered in a brief kind of visual way. And I'd be happy to answer questions as we go along. But it was just a labor of love, and I'm happy to share it with you. So let me put some pictures up here on the screen, if I can do that. Let's see. There we go. All right. All right. So, whaling in Maine, or Maine whaling. I was on the name of the book. I didn't want people to think it was just whaling in the state of Maine. It was more the state of Maine in the American whaling industry. But as we went along, and like I always do with most of my talks, I put up contact information, because I always find that there are people who are interested in asking about more or coming up with their own information, and I'm always looking for more information. So please contact me if you have any questions or anything like that. When it started, I thought Maine whaling pretty much went back to maybe the start of the state in about the 1820s, but I was so wrong. I found out that whaling actually goes before European and colonial development with the Native Americans. Many of them have mythical stories of some of their leaders, the Abenaki. There's a leader called Gluskap who basically was friends with the whales and so forth. They would hunt them, but they also had like working relationships. One of the pictures you see is he gave a whale, some tobacco, and the whale is smoking and so forth. So the connection with the Native Americans in whaling go even farther back. But with the colonial development, it was very interesting, because most of the whaling in the early days were basically whales that washed up on shore of Maine. So there really wasn't whaling ships. There really wasn't the need to. But that was kind of hit or miss. This is a photo from the 1920s, actually, on Ragged Island, that a whale washed up and they're cutting pieces off it. So it still happens. But that was basically how they got most of their whales in the early days. And so you didn't need much of a whaling craft or vessel. it was basically on shore already. That started to change by the turn of the century into the 1800s. And that was when more and more Mainers started to develop ships and vessels to get to the whaling and sealing grounds farther north, off Baffin Island, off Greenland, and so forth. And so we see the development of the whaling Greenland fisheries. And this is where I found some of my first real connections. On the Cranberry Isles, I found a ship, references to a ship called the Minerva. It was built in 1820, and it was owned by a man named Samuel Hadlock Jr. And he had convinced the entire community of the Cranberry Islands to kind of go in as a community effort to go get whales, because it could be very lucrative, but it was high risk and high reward. So he built this ship. It was a two-masted schooner, about 75 tons, had 17 crew members. And I was thinking about that because the ship did not come back. And I thought, you know, that's a tragic story in and of itself. But the demographic hit that this Cranberry Island community had when 17 of their young men were gone, you know, it's just profound. I mean, that just ripples through the generations, almost like a London village in an English village during World War I, you know, where, you know, most of the young men were gone, sort of thing. And so that really hit home the fact that when these communities did put these efforts together, it was a very high risk, high reward type of thing. But that's how they had to do it, because it was a fairly expensive thing to outfit a ship and crew it and to sail off into the Greenland areas. These are two panels by a Dutch artist in the Penobscot Marine Museum that show the Greenland fisheries. And Europe had been going over there, European powers, but so did early Americans as well, right about the turn of the century into the 1800s. And why? What are we after? Well, with the whaling, obviously it's the whale oil for lamps. The spermaceti from sperm whales could make candles. You know, there was a lot of different remains of the whales that could be used. The baleen. So the ships got bigger because they're going to be away from shore longer. They also started to be built bigger so that they could hold the barrels of the oil that they would melt down and then send ships back. So what does that have to do with Maine? Well, the shipbuilding is going to be important for Maine, but also the need for ships, and not just whaling ships, but maybe merchant ships that would haul your first 2 years worth of catch back to Maine while you stayed on station hunting for more. So here's some baleen from a whale. I teach students, so I'm always looking for illustrations of what I'm talking about. And, you know, I throw the word out baleen. A lot of people, well, what is that really? Well, it's basically the filter system for whales, for some of the whales that eat. Not the sperm whales, those are toothed whales. But these are, you know, the combs in the mouths that basically strain the foods. And you can see removing the whole jaw piece, it's a very durable type of material. In fact, it's the early kind of like plastic. It's very durable, and they turned it into women's corsets. They used them for umbrella pieces. You know, it was a very durable type of material. And so when they talk about how much whale bone they brought back, this is what they're referring to in the amount of materials. And we're talking many tons that some ships brought back. Here's some scrimshaw is another name from the whales, either the whale bones or the whale teeth. Those were often carved by the whalers into all kinds of different items. You see a belaying pin and some tools and so forth. And that's very interesting. That's a great way to kind of see also how much Maine has in the way of connections with whaling is the Scrimshaw Collections around the state. There's a great one at the Penobscot Marine Museum in Seaport, also down in Bath at the Maine Maritime Museum. I like this picture because it has a swift in the corner. And I'm not sure if you know what a swift is, but it helps with the yarn when it rotates and it helps you spin the yarn. And this was totally made of whalebone in the Bath Museum. Hairpins made from baleen. And then obviously the teeth from the sperm whale were also carved. I found this group of teeth down in the New Bedford Whaling Museum. And what I found was that they were carved by a person referred to as the pagoda artisan, because he would always carve a bunch of little Chinese pagodas on the teeth. Well, it turned out to be a Maine native. He was from Pittsfield, Maine. And his name was Sylvanus Baker. And he became very well known. And I looked up his information about being on board a ship. There's a database of material about this that I'll tell you about in a little bit. But he only sailed on two trips. They were 3 years each, but so for 6 years. But he became, he basically created his historical identity, with these carvings and so forth. Other things I found of interest that were connected with Maine was these community efforts. Portland was the first to try it after, like, the Cranberry Isles people did. They outfitted a ship called Science and went out for a couple of whale trips. And then Wiscasset was kind of next. And they built a ship and named it the Wiscasset. And what's interesting about this whale ship is, it's 380 tons. It was built in the 1830s. And on its 1836 whaling voyage, they captured a sperm whale, and a guy happened to carve the ship's likeness on it. And it kind of went into, a museum and so forth. Well, after the ship went out of whaling, and many ships did, they would whale for a few years and then go be something else. It was a passenger carrier across the Atlantic. And a young, penniless Scotsman by the name of Andrew Carnegie came across it to America, who goes on to become the dominant steel industrialist, of the 19th century. And the interesting thing about this is that they found that tooth from the 1836 voyage, and they presented it to Andrew Carnegie. And they said, well, this was captured aboard the ship Wiscasset that you must be familiar with. And he goes, the Wiscasset? Oh my gosh, that thing rolled so badly. It was slow, it was uncomfortable, I hated it. In fact, his private yacht was 380 tons bigger than the Wiscasset that he came over on. And I thought, that's a pretty cool connection. So these communities would go into these ventures. 1837, the Panic of 1837 really was a downturn. Communities kind of got out of it and centered or focused more on shore fishing cod or things like that. One of my earliest connections is the name Lauder. I did my research on a Revolutionary War trading post or truck house up on the Penobscot. Well, the truckmaster's son, William Lauder, I found some references, went into whaling himself in the 1790s, early 1800s. The problem, though, is that records are very sketchy and very incomplete before the 1820s, definitely before the War of 1812. After that, they really started to regulate and keep better records, so forth. Well, those records have all been created and put into the National Maritime Digital Library. And that is just a phenomenal database. And it's on a spreadsheet. And so what I was able to do is I was able to sort out a lot of the names that listed their hometowns in Maine. Not everybody did. In fact, a very small percentage of the entire 200,000 names in the database did. But what I was able to do was I therefore came out with about 1,800 names of Mainers who were either born in the state or who lived in the state that were associated with whale ships and whaling trips. So I have this database, and then I also have a list of whaling ships or ships in Maine that got involved with whaling, and I would often cross-reference the two as I did my research. And what I ended up doing was finding almost topically or locally, I would look like Waldo County. Okay, well, I found so many people from there, and they served on these ships on these years. It just provided a ton of information. And so that's kind of how my book kind of came together. So some of the people of Mainers that were pretty famous with whaling, one of them is a guy named Dinsmore, David Dinsmore. And what's interesting about him is that he was from China, Maine, and he heard it was a calling, almost like a religious calling, like a voice saying, you should go into whaling. And he did, and he worked his way up, and he was a captain, and instituted a lot of religious services on board ships, and then gave up whaling, went into spiritualism, and ended up moving out to the West Coast. And he wrote this really great autobiography called The Halo, which just tells this incredible story of this person associated with whaling. This guy is Abel Douglas, not my uncle, but this was the photo I found of him. He's a native of Idaho. He immigrated out of California in the 80s and founded what's called Whaletown, which is a whaling station off British Columbia that was basically a big rendezvous point for many of the Shanghai whalers out of San Francisco and the Alaskan whalers that would come down. And so he made his name that way, this Idaho native. Charles Cushing, born in 1833 in South Berwick. He went into whaling, made a lot of money, and got out just before the Panic of 1837. Some of the even bigger names is Merrill. This is Edward Merrill. As a young guy, as in his prime, and then as an elderly gentleman. Edward Merrill, again, was a Mainer from Durham, Maine. Went into whaling, started as a regular sailor, worked his way up, started owning whale ships. He eventually is going to build Merrill's Wharf in New Bedford. Very famous wharf. Here you see a stereoscopic view of it in its heyday. And then I walked out on it when I was down on at the New Bedford Museum to give you a modern version of the photo as well. But great connections with it. I mean, it's a pretty well-known, famous wharf in New Bedford, even on Scrimshaw here that you can see. And again, every time I came upon a name, I would try to track them down. Where are they now? Where are they buried? Where did they end up, and so forth. And that just led me to even more pieces. The Belfast Historical Society, I mentioned a couple Belfast whalers from my database, and they said, oh, well, you should know about the Oar King, David Pierce of Montville. I'm like, Montville? And they turned me to a Republican Journal article from 1831 that basically called him the Oar King. And I guess he had an exclusive contract with both New Bedford and New London to make all of the whaleboat oars for them. He made them by hand from local ash, and he would get $60 per every 1,000 feet. And he shipped over 100,000 feet per year. And I'm just trying to imagine. And so some further research I'm interested in doing is I want to go see if I can find where in Montville he did this, and is he buried somewhere there or something like that? Because I think that's incredible to become known as the Oar King here from Montville, Maine. So not only did we have sailors from Maine become captains, but they also became, entrepreneurs about it, or they used the natural materials of Maine to also help supply the whaling industry as well. Some of these entrepreneurs went on to become inventors. And this leads me to the Pierce brothers, both from Hollowell. Eben Pierce and his brother Job. Eben Pierce was an inventor. They both went into whaling, and he came up with a better idea for a harpoon, his darting gun. It becomes a bomb lance. And he gets into a business association with a man named Eggers. And eventually he patents the Pierce and Eggers gun in 1879, which is a shoulder-fired bomb lance that they would fire into the whale. And this is Eben Pierce. And you see the monument stone there. I found where he was buried over in a small cemetery in Farmingdale, right overlooking the Kennebec River. And so I took this picture, and then I noticed this was just like a monument stone to him. And I noticed his headstone was just a little bit over to the right. And I walked over and looked at it. And as I was reading it, he's on the top piece there. But then it says Job Pierce, his brother, who was lost on board a whaler named Lively in 1852. And so that kind of hit home as well, that this was a very tough industry and many people didn't come back. In fact, I read somewhere in my researches that many of the graves in Maine between 1830s and 1860, a lot of them are empty because there's a high percentage of them that are empty because they were lost at sea. And these are just memorial markers basically for them. You have Captain Leander Owens of Brownfield, prolific whaling captain. I mean, this guy, he died in 1911 and had spent over 45 years in whaling, you know, with just tremendous totals. And what do I mean by totals? Well, again, I go back to like the database, and this would be like one of the screens that would come up. And as you look it over, you can kind of see, you know, where he was born, his wife, you know, and so forth. But he had at least 13 voyages aboard different ships with years. And then they also gave like the tonnage of how many barrels were recovered and so forth. And so I was able to, you know, to line up ships, you know, like, oh, the Gira Perry. Oh, well, I found that was built in Maine, you know. So again, they just kept coming out these different types of connections with the database. And then I could go to the crew list or the log books for some of them even. Amos Chase, another example, you know, Leamington, Maine, you know, prolific captain, you know, for many, many years. And so I would find that when he passed away, I found him in a, down in Scarborough, or excuse me, down in Westbrook. He was buried in, I think it's called Sakarapa Cemetery in Westbrook. And so I was able to, you know, get a picture of his stone. You know, other types of connections were at the very local level, like here in Belfast, Maine. I found Thomas Jefferson Burgess. His story was kind of cool because he only went whaling on one ship, one trip, came back, and he must have got hurt or something because this was right before the Civil War. And during the Civil War, he got a draft notice that said, you need to report for Union duty. And he showed up and they said, oh, you got to go see a doctor. And the doctor said, no, his hip, he's got a trochanter major injury, and it was from whaling. So he ended up getting deferred from the American Civil War because of whaling. The Two Brothers was a ship built in Hollowell in 1804. You know, it went into whaling. It wrecked out in Hawaii in 1823, which, you know, that happened to a lot of the ships and so forth. And what was cool about this was that archaeologists have recently found it, and they've been excavating it. And here are some of the pieces from it, some of the ceramics and the iron harpoon heads and so forth, and some of the copper sheathing. So as I'm researching the Two Brothers, I find, wait a second, the captain of the Two Brothers is a guy named George Pollard Jr. And I don't know if you're familiar with George Pollard Jr., but he was the captain on board the whale ship Essex that got stove by a whale that Nathaniel Philbrook wrote a book about, and that they just had a big movie with Chris Helmsworth and so forth about, and it's what Herman Melville based Moby Dick upon. George Pollard was the captain. And this was like his second attempt at being a captain since the Essex disaster. And so when his ship, the Two Brothers, sank out in Hawaii, he's in a boat being rowed over to a nearby whaler that was there to help bring upon some of the survivors. And he turned to somebody and said, they're never going to give me command of a ship again. And they didn't. I mean, they considered him a Jonah. He was bad luck. But here you see some of the archaeologists working on what's called the tripots, which are the big iron pots on board the ship that they would use to melt down the blubber to render into barrels. I found ship logs. The Penobscot Marine Museum was great. They would pull out all these ship logs, and you're reading through these things. I mean, it was just incredible. This is the Caledonia logbook. Again, you know, just pulsating history. I found pictures or carvings of ships that were either built in Maine or up in Maine. that had gone into whaling. 1820 in Frankfurt, the Canova. I mean, that made a couple voyages to New Zealand in the 1840s, brought back 2,600 barrels of oil. The brig Montezuma made 14 voyages in 1838. This was pretty cool. The logbook of the United States whaler, storm damaged. You can maybe see the water stains from it. And, you know, it's talking about, you know, wicked bad storm, you know, and must have been, you know, some pretty tough conditions. Rockland built the schooner Flying Cloud, which went into whaling as well. Now that became part of the Stonington, Connecticut whaling fleet. And then again, back to some of the Scrimshaw, John Cog. And so what I would end up doing is I would find the name of a ship. I'd find out if it was built in Maine or not. I would find if there were Mainers who served on it, and I did, from that database. Charles Harris of Portland, Asa Thompson. They were on the 1855 to 59 voyage, and they brought back 1,261 barrels of oil, some of which was sperm oil, and 6 tons of baleen for the corsets and the umbrellas and the buggy whips. Well, what kind of brought this all to kind of a close was the American Civil War was kind of the first big knock against the whaling industry that knocked it on its heels. Many of the ships that were whalers were used as what was called the Stone Fleet. In fact, there were 2 of them, Stone Fleet 1 and Stone Fleet 2. And during the war, somebody got it in their idea that to blockade like Charleston Harbor, let's sink a bunch of ships in the entrance to the harbor. And they said, well, where are we going to find ships that aren't being used? Well, let's do the whaling ships, because with the war, there isn't going to be as much whaling. So they took a whole bunch of ships, and many of them I traced that were, you know, Maine connected or built, became part of the Stone Fleet, where they sank them into the Charleston Harbor and Moffett Channel down there. The Confederates obviously did not like that. They said it was horrible. In the end analysis, it proved not to be very effective at all, because Charleston, you know, still held out for quite a while. And Herman Melville was sad enough about this event that he ends up writing a poem called The Stone Fleet. And this is the first paragraph to it, or the first stanza to it, you know, about just how kind of a sad way for these ships to end up, you know, obsolete, you know, being part of the Stone Fleet. So I found that pretty interesting. The Civil War also did a number on active ships that were whaling, many of them built in Maine. Here's the Shenandoah burning whale ships off Cape Thaddeus, Siberia, right towards the end of the war. You know, so the Civil War was kind of the first major knock against the industry. They tried to revive it, though, afterwards. This is the John Carver. It's a whale ship built in Searsport, Maine. It's on the stocks here. And this painting is by Waldo Pierce, who, kind of another interesting connection, an artist, fairly well known. You know, he painted some of these whale scenes. And the John Carver went into service right after the Civil War. There's a ship's model at the Penobscot Marine Museum that I took a photo of here, that with the whale boats up on top the superstructure and so forth. You know, so they're trying to revive the industry, but it's not really working. They do try to mechanize it even better, though, with steam barks, mostly built in Bath. This was the Mary and Helen, one of the first come out and maneuver, especially in the ice in the northern Arctic, above Alaska, above Bering Strait. And by this point, this is where most of the whaling grounds are. You know, there aren't as much in the South Atlantic anymore, or in the South Pacific and so forth. The Belvedere, pretty famous ship for being a steam whaler, went into you know, whaling in the 1880, rolled off the stocks there. The Josephine, one of the last of the active whalers into the almost 1920s. Here you see it at the, found a couple photos of it at the wharf in New Bedford. And the ship's binnacle is in the New Bedford Museum. I was able to get a picture of it. But again, for its career, brought nearly 32,000 barrels of oil, you know, 10,000 of which were sperm whale oil, and over 180,000 pounds of baleen, 90 tons. Just a incredible amount, incredible. The Morning Star and the Navarch are two later steam whalers built in Bath. The Navarch was caught in the ice and crushed. So by this point, even with mechanization, the American whaling industry is pretty much on its last legs. By the turn of the century, it is definitely on its way out. The second major knock after the Civil War was there was a series of whaling disasters where a whole bunch of whale ships got caught in ice up above the Arctic, up above Alaska. 1871 was the first one. There was also one a few years later. There's a famous story of one year where the ships got caught in the ice and the men got onto shore, and three US Coast Guard men drove a herd of reindeer up to them to feed them. But that's kind of its own great story in and of itself. But these major disasters really hit a reeling industry to begin with. And archaeologists have since been able to identify some of the ships up above Point Barrow, Alaska, which is pretty cool. For me and for Maine and my story, we really start to wind down. The commercial whaling industry in Maine, or in the United States, was really pretty much over by World War I. However, in 1906, whaling in the Antarctic underway by the Norwegians. And what's interesting about that is that we have a Maine connection. One of the ships that Carl Anton Larsen, who is the father of commercial whaling for Norway and the Antarctic, picked to go down to Grytviken, South Georgia Island, was the Louise. Now, the Louise had originally been known as the Jenny Barker, built in Freeport in 1866. It was a merchant, went around Cape Horn, got involved in a South American shooting war, did the transatlantic packet, and by the early 1900s, it was sitting in a fjord up in Norway, rotting away. And Carl Anton Larsen looked at it and said, hey, I need that ship, because he needed it for a one-way trip. And they sailed it to Buenos Aires and then down into South Georgia Island. And at Grytviken in South Georgia, you see the wreck of it here in the picture right by the cemetery. And it was their storehouse for a long time, their bunkhouse, and then eventually a mooring barge, and then a wreck. The Grytviken Cemetery is fairly famous because the polar explorer Sir Ernest Shackleton was buried there when he died down in the Antarctic, and they buried him there. So even with the commercial whaling starting the more modern era, there's still a Maine connection, which I found kind of interesting. Yeah, here you see a wreck of it. This was taken by a fellow guest lecturer of mine, because he was like going to Grytviken, and I said, oh, can you get a picture of the Louise? He says, there's not much left. I said, well, that's the point. I want you to get a picture of it. So that's what we did. And then my last connection is actually a World War II tugboat that was built in Rockland, at the Elliott Gamage Yard in Rockland. It was known as the ATA 215 tugboat. It went out to the Pacific, did service out there, survived the big typhoon late in the war, came back and was U.S. Navy surplus. And a guy named Finn Ronnie wanted to go to Antarctica in 1947 with the Ronnie Antarctic Expedition, and he talked the U.S. Navy into loaning it to him. They renamed it the Port of Beaumont, and they left from Beaumont, Texas, and they took dogs with them, and they went down and they established a base pretty much near Palmer Station that's down there today. Spent a year and a half in the ice, and then came back and was put into the whaling and sealing industry in the Arctic, and eventually sank off Newfoundland. So again, just, every time you shake the tree, just more and more connections came up with it. I'm just amazed at the amount of people with these connections. And so it really helped kind of formulate my book to talk about just how they were able to make whaling happen and their connections. And I think that can hold its own against New Bedford, Nantucket, or any of them. And like I said, I'm still getting more and more people telling me even more connections all the time. And I find that very exciting. So that's what I have. I want to thank you. I always put my contact information I hope I haven't chatted on too long or anything, but if you have some questions ready for me, or.
No, if anyone has a question, once again, go ahead and type it into the chat box and send it on over, and I will relay that question to Charles. And in the meantime, while we wait to see if anyone types in any questions, thank you, by the way. That was a wonderful presentation. It was very comprehensive, and I can only from that get a taste of the amount of research that has gone into this. And speaking of that research, you did mention that that you had kind of collected 1,800 names in a database of people related to Maine whaling.
Right.
Is that a database that you've made public? And if so, is there any way people can access that?
I haven't made it public. It was basically me just kind of sifting and sorting through the larger database from the National Marine Digital Library. And so I ended up just basically, I sorted out and got everybody with from Maine or ME, and then basically cut and pasted that onto its own. But yes, I would definitely make that available. My goal with this book was to kind of make it so that families with genealogy interests, could use it as kind of an avenue to go a little bit farther, but also any town along Maine, or a historical society or something, because it's just a phenomenal amount of information, and every one of them is a great story. I mean, I would come upon like 5 guys from the Augusta area that signed aboard a whale ship, and I'm thinking, well, they probably knew each other. Maybe some were related, but I can just imagine these 5 guys. Well, I'll sign up if you do. Okay, let's go. and that whole story in and of itself, I think, is just incredible. And I would love for that to kind of, not get lost somewhere. And especially if somebody was related to, any of them or something like that. So yeah, my hope is that, historical societies can make good use of this. As well as families and genealogy, and even my interest in it is I'm not done either. I'm still interested. I kind of want to almost pick a county and just go down to ground zero there and see just how much like Waldo County was involved with it, right, or something like that.
You could easily go down the rabbit hole. Okay, we've had some questions come in. The first one is from Julie. It says, hi, could you please explain a little more about the difference between sperm whale oil and regular whale oil? Okay,
sperm whale oil was kind of like a higher grade. It was more refined. It was more easily manipulated into like the candles or the, that type. It burned cleaner. And so it was kind of a higher prized commodity, but it was tougher to find. The regular whale oil was mostly rendered, by a lot of different whales of different, kinds. The right whale, I mean, that's how it's got its name. It was the right whale for what they wanted, that sort of thing. And then the other difference between them is that, right whales and stuff are baleen. They're the filter feeders, and the sperm whales are the teeth eaters that eat mostly like squid or things like that.
Thank you. Our next question is, how often did Maine ships bring their cargoes back to Maine, and which ports?
Wow, good question. A lot of the Maine ships, if it was a community effort, they would bring it back to the community, like the Portland experiment or the Wiscasset back to Wiscasset. But many of the Maine ships, actually, if they did go into the business, it went either through Nantucket or New Bedford. But they were, Maine origin ships. The interesting about Nantucket is that they kind of got superseded by New Bedford, because as the ships got bigger to start going around Cape Horn and out into the Pacific and so forth, the sandbars around Nantucket couldn't accommodate those larger ships. And so Nantucket was the first of the major whaling centers, but then got kind of eclipsed by New Bedford, because New Bedford had a better harbor for the ships to get into. But Maine was building ships to accommodate both, which I thought was very smart for Maine to do that. But yeah, the community-based efforts, they returned to the States, but the others were mostly through the bigger, like New London, Connecticut, or New Bedford and Nantucket.
The next question is, do you know any specifics about Maine ships that were part of the whaling disaster of 1871?
Yeah, I don't have it right in front of me, but I do mention it in the book. I listed the ships that I knew, were Maine ships. And again, as I was writing this, I had the database on one side, I had my list on the other, and I'm cross-referencing. And I would find like a newspaper article that listed the names of some of the ships that were lost. And I'm like, oh, okay, that matched up. Yeah, the Mary and Helen were lost, that sort of thing. It was significant enough that, I mentioned it in the book, and I noticed it that, wow, a lot of those lost were from Maine. Same thing with the Confederate Raiders during the Civil War. They snuck in actually it was after the Civil War. In fact, that's one of the cool things. One of the last ships to get fired and sunk by a Confederate Raider was a Maine ship. So you could say that the Civil War's last shot was, fired, had a Maine connection there. But
the next question is from Christine. She asks, could you talk a little bit about how the whaling ships were financed?
Okay, with the community effort, it had to be financed, by a lot of people, and they would sell shares into it. And they would they would go around for either subscriptions, or they would try to get people to back them. That David Dinsmore I was telling you about, he went around and he convinced people with the sheer personality of, here's this guy from China, Maine saying, I've got a calling, I want to go whaling. I need you to write me a check so that I can go whaling. And he was able to do that. He was able to talk a lot of these, townspeople into parting with money. And he was successful at it. So it was a lot of raising the funds on your own. And that's what made it very difficult. Many of the ship captains would buy into part of the ship that they were the captain of. The owner would say, I'll give you a quarter share in the ship and the profits from it. Would you be interested? And the captain would do that. And so they pieced it out little by little. In fact, that's how they turned around and then paid the sailors as well. You signed up and you got 1/55th of the, they called them lays, 1/55th lay of whatever you took and so forth. It was a very well set up economic system. And we were chatting earlier, actually before this began, about the possibility that if you worked hard at it, you could make a name for yourself. And this was one of the first equal opportunity types of employment. I mean, there were African Americans who did well. There were Native Americans who did well at it. There were people who came from nothing and did very, very well with, the whaling industry. So there was a lot of money to be made during its heyday.
Eileen is kind of piggybacking on that, and she wants to know if you happen to know of any whalers of color, African descent, First Nations, etc., who worked in the whaling community in Maine. Are there any stories about particular individuals?
Well, as I went through the database, it was very hit or miss. Sometimes they would do a description of the person, but not a very good description, or there was one that, just described, no, he walked with a limp, and I'm like, why would you write that? I mean, but it's interesting in that, like today it might say, Caucasian, African-American or something like on a list. But back then it was just, John Doe signed aboard as a boat steerer, was from, Augusta, Maine. And then was invalided home from, the Canary Islands in 1842. I mean, there might be something like that. So the descriptions aren't as helpful as I would like, because I'm sure, especially in more of the whaling centers like Nantucket and New Bedford, well, even Seaport was pretty cosmopolitan in its day of, people of all kinds of races and ethnicities, because your crews of ships were multinational as well. And so that's a great area for further research, definitely.
Yeah, it sounds like the documentation would make it a little tricky, but definitely worth the investigating.
Right.
Julie has written a question. Was the entire coast of Maine represented in the whaling industry?
Uh, yes, I was able to find ships that were built as far down east as like Robinson Island and Pembroke, and all the way back, towards Boston, like York. So the coast was definitely well represented with shipbuilding. The interior of the state seemed to be well represented for sailors and crewmen and captains. And then both the coast and the interior was pretty well represented for like, the ship materials, like the oars, that they needed, or the masts, that a lot of the ships used, and so forth. So it was definitely an entire state effort. And I recognize this because our state of Maine flag, has a farmer on one side and a maritime person on the other. And I can't help but think, that maritime person, that could be a whaler. That could be a whaling sailor, not just a merchant sailor.
Yeah, I mean, the river system within the state of Maine really allowed, people to travel pretty far inland. So that makes a lot of sense that you would be having some representation of,
Right.
of folks, in the Augusta area and such.
Yeah. Well, especially when I would find that like a ship that was built in Hollowell.
Yeah.
Well, Hollowell, wow, that's way up the Kennebec. Okay, yeah. I can see that, and it went whaling out into the ocean. I mean, that's pretty cool.
Another question came in from Janet. What did the baleen filter out that the whales did not want to eat?
Good question. It basically acted as kind of like a wire screen, and it allowed the krill to go in. The shrimp-like crustacean, kind of no bigger than your little fingernail, but it would also help to eliminate the water. And so you're basically kind of just sifting in the food, and then you're squirting the water on the sides out of it. And it was very effective. I've never seen one really up close. We had a few in the Antarctic that, we pointed out during my time down there, but that I'd like to know a little bit more about the whole system to it, because, they're just incredible animals, and I think even the whaling captains had that type of respect for them. And I understand it was pretty heavy whaling, wholesale slaughter in some cases, and they basically hunted them to the verge of extinction. But it was also it was not an easy thing for captains to do. And I think there was some grudging respect to these animals, which I think is kind of an element in like Moby Dick, and Ahab's quest, and so forth, that, these were intelligent animals that, they were, quote, pitted against, and wow, that's a whole another area for research there. But.
Yeah, and extremely powerful. It's just daunting when you read descriptions in books like Moby Dick and In the Heart of the Sea that describe, the Nantucket sleigh ride, and just the sheer terror of, what happens after you've speared the whale.
And I'm trying to picture these 19-year-old, Maine farm boy standing there, going, oh my gosh, what have I gotten myself into here? Yeah. I had the good fortune to go down to Mystic, Connecticut, and I walked out on the Charles Morgan, the whaler, and it was a blistery, cold February day, and I'm standing there, and the wind's howling off the water and right into your teeth, and I'm standing there thinking, there is no way I could do something like this. I mean, and that was in port, Yeah. These people were tough. They were really, really tough people that put up with some really tough conditions.
This question sort of goes along with what we were just talking about, but you might have additional information to expand upon it. It says, it seems like the majority of people you mentioned tonight were from inland as opposed to coastal towns. Did you find that to be the case overall?
Yeah, I did. And again, these are only the ones that actually even had a Maine designation by their name. I tend to think that of those 200,000 names, I found, like 1,800, but I think at least double that, if not more, were also from Maine, but just didn't say they were from Maine. That sort of thing. So I think there's even, more connection than what I was able to kind of cobble together. But I think the coastal were represented, but I think it was the lure of getting off the farm from the interior that, a lot of these young men, jumped at. And that's what it seemed to be, the promise of reward, the promise that, and it seemed very cut and dry that you could advance fairly quickly, and the training, advancement was definitely possible. You could move up the ranks literally quite quickly, either through, accidents of, or attrition, or, if you had your wits about you, you could really make something of yourself with these. But I think, wanting to get out of the small town, I grew up in a small town in Kansas, and I felt that urge to, I want to see what's beyond this small town. So I bet it's the same for many of them.
Yeah. Little did they know what they were signing up for. 3 years away from home, treacherous experience on the ocean, Cape Horn, all that good stuff. Right. So Eileen has asked, one of the examples of Scrimshaw features a person of color pulling a wagon. Do you know anything about that image's meaning or that story?
No. When I was researching the Merrill Wharf, that image came up when I contacted, there's a restaurant actually down there called Merrill's on the waterfront that had the photographs of Merrill as I think it was in his prime. And I was chatting with them, and they said, well, there's also a photograph of a tooth, and so I think it shows that there were a lot of people involved in this industry. A lot of it was manual labor, but beyond that, I don't know much more on that.
We have a question that came in asking, how many oars would it take to make 1,000 feet?
Yeah, that I started to think on that too, because my understanding is that each oar boat that Pierce did that for, David Pierce, was that you needed 9 oars. And I'm thinking 9, that doesn't sound right, but 1 is a steering oar. But 2 would be like 8 foot long, 2 would be 10 foot long, and 2 would be 6 foot long, so that the boat, I guess, can maneuver easily or better. I'm not sure, but just the sheer footage of what you were saying, because that article had the quote about, yes, cranked out, how many, per 1,000, $60 per 1,000 feet. And I thought, well, what would that really look like? That's why I want to go find the place where he did this. I'm not sure if the structure still exists, but it'd be kind of cool to walk around the grounds where, what do you have? Like a foot powered lathe or something? I mean, or was it just mostly by, hand that he fashioned these things? But to crank them out and to have over 100,000 feet, per year, per annum. I mean, that's just amazing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And for anyone who is listening to this or watching this and may not have had an opportunity to visit a place like Mystic Seaport, it's an excellent opportunity, obviously during safer times in the future, an excellent opportunity to sort of immerse yourself in this time period. They have moved several historic buildings to this little area in Mystic, and they also have the last remaining wooden whale ship in the American fleet that Charles mentioned, that Charles W. Morgan. And again, you can see people working on these old maritime crafts, making ropes, coopering barrels, all sorts of stuff like that. So they might be great people to ask about, the oar production. Like, how could you even churn out that many? It's phenomenal.
Exactly. And I found that, the ones here in Maine too, the museums, the Penobscot Marine Museum, the Maine State Museum, the Maine Maritime Museum in Bath, just phenomenally nice and approachable and friendly. You know, they let me go into the, you know, their photographic collections. They, you know, they were very helpful. And they got excited as I did, you know, and I'd be like, oh, hey, look what I found. They're like, oh, cool. You know, I mean, they were right there with you. And these are great facilities. And I wish, you know, we get back to, you know, people getting to these places, because they're definitely treasures of historical information.
I agree completely. I know the Penobscot Marine Museum is doing more individualized tours this year as their format, and so I imagine that would give folks an opportunity to really get some nice one-on-one time with an interpreter who could answer some great questions if this was an area that they were interested in. We have one last question that came in from Eileen. She was asking me if I have any family connection with the Pierce whalers. Oh, we've got another question after that, that sort of fuels my enthusiasm. I don't know, but I'm going to send the recording of this video to my father-in-law after this is done, so he can write down all these different names and do some research. There's one more question that just came in. This will be our last one. It says, New Bedford was also called the Fugitives Gibraltar, a haven for escaping slaves pre-Civil War. Its free community of color was thriving and its abolitionist voice strong. Little wonder that the Scrimshaw from Merrill's would contain such an image. So yes, that's a good connection there.
Yep, definitely.
Thank you for that information, Eileen. Very helpful. So again, as I mentioned, we have recorded this evening, and if anyone is interested in sharing it, I'm going to be posting it shortly on the Camden Public Library Program's YouTube page. And for anyone who's interested in finding out about more of these types of talks that we do, please visit librarycamden.org. These talks are always free and open to everyone. Just send me an email and request a link, and I'm happy to send it to you. Charles, thank you so much. So your book is out now, right? It's very recently published. So
yep, through Arcadia Publishing, easily available, or contact me. Yeah, I hope people really, like it. It was a great story. I got, I really enjoyed the research. That was most fun, especially, tracking down, little tidbit and stories here and there and so forth. I just really enjoyed it.
Real quick, last question from me. Are you working on a new book next?
Actually, yeah. I'm also a scuba diver, and I've been kind of compiling a database of shipwrecks around Penobscot Bay. And I'm kind of thinking, something like that might, be worthwhile to put together or something at some point. But I'm still interested in, following more up on the whaling connections as well. Like I said, I kind of like the idea of a deep dive into the whalers of Waldo County, and because I found there were two from, just some small towns around, and I'm thinking, really, I can imagine what's the story of these two guys, leaving this little town in Maine to go out onto the ocean after whales. So yeah, there's more work to do.
Super. Well, I look forward to it. I'm very excited about this book, and thank you so much for presenting this information for us. This is a huge part of Maine's past, and just wonderful that we can get this knowledge out there. So thank you again, Charles. Thank you to everyone who joined us this evening. It's been very eye-opening for me, and I hope for you as well. And I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of their night. So take care and enjoy the sunshine. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.